On to our next case study today, open source reality check with Ruben, Nick, and Aron Ambrosiani. I'm going to read their bios. Ruben wrote his own. Bear that in mind. Ruben is a Portland, Oregon native and human-centric software engineer. He used to do computer stuff for the innovation studio at the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, but now he does phone stuff for ShowClicks. Sometimes he's funny, often he's not, and if your favorite ice cream flavor is vanilla, you can not be his friend. All right. It's a good bio, actually. Aron Ambrosiani is a digital media producer at the Nordic Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, working with digital installations both in gallery and online. His most recent project was a new audio guide made in collaboration with Ruben and the Innovation Studio. Aron's worked at a few Swedish museums in various digital roles. And with that, I will take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to switch over here.
I'm just going to stand behind you and be your hype man.
All right. So, as you might have noticed already at the conference, there is always this kind of ongoing discussion of open source without digging into the details of how do you actually make this possible and what happens when you try to actually collaborate on an open source project. So we did this and are going to talk a bit about what we learned in the process. This is more like a teaser on what happens when you try to do this. So we can't, of course, go into all the details in this 15-minute session, but hopefully you will get enough takeaways to realize whether you need or want to talk more with us or not. So that's kind of our aim with this session, to give an introduction into what happens when you collaborate on an open source project. So what was this project? Maybe you should start with.
So back in 2016, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Andy Warhol Museum launched the Warhol Outloud, right, which was an initiative in order to build an audio guide that also had physical elements for the blind or partially sighted. When I was pulled onto that project, one thing I was really interested in, and I noticed in the museum sphere is, open source was a buzzword, right? It was just something people threw around. It was some feature that, helped you get a grant, basically, right? But what oftentimes happened is after you released that code, nobody looked at it, right? You didn't look at it. Nobody else looked at it. Nobody maintained it. And the other thing that kind of stuck out to me is, as a software engineer, if I go to a code repo and there's not build instructions and I can't build something in 30 minutes, I leave it. I don't have time. And that was something I saw time and time again. So I, put this in front of Desi and I said, hey, if we're doing this open source, we have to do it right. We have to make sure that, it is released in such a way that whoever downloads it can build it in 30 minutes, flat. So, it's sort of like one of the questions that, about open source is, who's responsible for maintaining it? Well, if you released it, ultimately you're responsible for maintaining it, right? Tech, unfortunately, it slowly disintegrates, right? Bit rot is an actual thing. The products that I build oftentimes have a half-life shorter than radioactive materials. So, maintenance needs to be built into these projects before you actually even decide, okay, we're going to open source it. Because otherwise, that's really cool that you open sourced it, but in a year, it's not even going to be usable anymore. Why don't you take the next slide?
Yeah. In my museum, we had the situation where we had a custom hardware for our audio guide, which was being taken out of production. So in about half a year, we knew we had to switch to a new platform. And we had a few needs that we had identified from our front-end staff and from speaking directly to visitors. One big problem at the Nordic Museum is that, as many other museums, it's an old stone building, so there's no cell reception, It's a huge building, so it's very expensive to install Wi-Fi everywhere, which means that if we want to offer our audio material, we want to offer it offline. You should be able to carry it with you through the museum without having to worry about connection. And we, as a Swedish museum, most people don't speak Swedish in the world. We want to offer multiple languages. We have, in total, 15 different languages in the audio guide in various amounts. So when we looked around at what platforms could we choose from, trying to find something that would work for us, there was no ready-made solution out of the box, regardless of the different vendors or platforms that exist. None of them could cover all these issues. So regardless of what we picked, we would have to invest time and money into the process. So that's why we eventually decided we should try to do this together with another institution and see what happens when you do this open source collaboration. So we did for a few months and made it all the way to a released product for our museum, working with the Innovation Studio for about 3 months from start to finish, essentially adding multi-language support and redoing the front end of the app that was already released and worked out of the box. So our main takeaway was this. Is open source cheaper than contractors? No, it's not. You still need to work and figure out how to use this, how to adapt it to your own situation. It is, however, not more expensive either. So we looked at this, and it would be about the same investment from us, regardless of joining an existing platform or approaching an external contractor or doing this open source collaboration. And we felt that we would learn a lot more by doing this together with another museum than the other alternatives. So the end result is, on the front end side, very different from the original app at the Warhol Museum. And we touched upon this a bit in the previous session here with some funders, external funders, discussing what kinds of projects to fund at museums. And there was some talk on how to build infrastructure and platforms that can be shared, but then every museum will always want their own front end on top of this to tailor-make the experience to their own use needs and to what their visitors are expecting. Needs to fit into the wider experience at your museum. So I think we accomplished this.
Yeah, so if you can go to the next one. First of all, Aron, I really like this good guy, bad guy thing we're slowly doing right here, because I'm going to say other mean things right now. I'll call other things buzzwords as well. But so why would you even choose open source, right? If you don't really save money, if you actually have to dedicate resources towards marketing open source, which is weird, right? Because we think of open source as you open source it and people will find it. That's not necessarily how it works, right? You need to market it. You need to build that community. You need to actually get it in front of people and let it know that it fits their needs. Not only that, but when you start building, you need to build in such a way to be extendable, right? To know where certain extension points lie and what museums are going to ask for. So when I started working on the Warhol Outloud, the first thing I did was I separated all of the UI code into separate modules, which is why I was able to reskin the app in a very a way that made the Nordic Museum not look like a cheap knockoff of the Warhol Museum, right? But why do we even care about this? I think one of the things that we're starting to realize I think at least the museum industry is starting to realize, like, if you really care about your product, you should own it, right? If you really care about your mobile product, you need to have control over that. Because, right, if that is an integral experience to your museum, then why wouldn't you control it? Otherwise, you're giving an experience to, you're letting somebody else define the experience of your museum. And I think that's one way that open source can help us, right? That you control that product. That product is yours. You can take it in whatever direction you want, even if you're a smaller institution, right? Because if you're buying something, some prepackaged product from some other museum, and guess what? You're not one of their major clients, your feature requests or your direction for the product is going to be pretty low on their totem pole. I hate to say that, but that's, they got to care about their bottom line, right? Whereas if it's open source, you can twist that product in whatever direction you want. The other thing is to actually build a community, right? The fact that Aron and I, got to know each other and meet each other and create a product that we feel like hits both of our museums' needs, I think is absolutely wonderful, right? We're slowly trying to build this community, because I think oftentimes museums actually, we're trying to solve a lot of the same problems. So why don't we work together on some of those?
While maintaining the possibility to tailor-make everything just the way you and your boss and your front-end staff and your visitors want it to be. Maybe that's a good place to end on the good cop note. Thank you so much for coming.
Time for a couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions?
How do you, with the way technology is going, and I'm not familiar with the guts of the app and the structure of it, but how do you cleanly separate the UI part from the actual data at the end?
Yes.
And how do you collaborate with other institutions to see if that's actually possible?
So the first thing is making sure that you've architected the code in such a way that that's even possible, right? So that needs to be part of the planning process for the software engineers on the team. There's a few different frameworks for that. There's Model View Controller. Sorry, I'm going to go a little bit deep in here, right? That are industry practice, but oftentimes in the museum world, I don't see them practiced, unfortunately. So I think museum projects in general need to catch up on this, especially if they want their projects used by other museums. So yeah, that needs to be on the forefront of the software engineers. So if you hire a contractor and you want them to open source their work, one of the ticket items, you need to say, hey, I want this to be skinnable. And they should be able to interpret that, what that means.
So in the process of your collaboration, have you gone beyond and had any success in building your community?
Well, it's always difficult to say. I think the Nordic Museum is a central player in Sweden in the museum field, but internationally, of course, we're in the periphery. Most things are going on in the English-speaking countries, at least as far as I am concerned. It's where I find new, interesting initiatives. So there has been a lot of interest in Sweden from the other museums over there on okay, how can we take this forward? Is it a viable fit for us? Especially the museums looking for offline audio guide use. That's, I think, the main point for us when we went into this project. As long as you have cell reception or Wi-Fi, don't build apps. Then you can offer mobile websites instead, and there are some open source alternatives there as well, of course. But for our specific use, offline, there has been a lot of interest in Sweden, from the other local museums.
The other thing that we sort of define as success is not only did the Nordic Museum audio guide, not only was it a fork off of the Warhol Outloud and some of that code was used in the Nordic Museum, But in the recent version of the Warhol Outloud, which I understand some of you on Tuesday went and looked at, actually some Nordic Museum code actually got into there. So specifically the code that controls the news ticker, if you have a name of a title too long, that was developed for the Nordic Museum, and also the expandable headers for the different floors. So in that case, yeah, we're really happy that has sort of branched all the way back into the Warhol Out Loud.
I think that can go out. Thank you again very much.